Hey everyone, welcome back to not only the final part of The New Kid, but also the final part of this book. Trust me, the ending is pretty crazy. I say that with literally almost every single one of these stories, but that's because it's usually true. And of course, there's the Stitch Wraith teaser at the end. All in all, should just be a good finale to this book. So, let's begin. Devin was afraid to go to sleep that night. He thought he'd have nightmares. But he didn't. He was so tired at the end of the day that sleep was like a black void, and the black void was his friend. Not only was it a blanket of blissful nothingness that wiped out the events of the day, it had a lingering effect the next morning. It acted sort of like one of the sheer curtains his mom had hung in their kitchen. You could still see through it, but it obscured the details. Tuesday morning, Devin knew what he'd done the day before. He remembered everything, but it was just murky enough to feel unreal, as if he'd watched it on a scary movie instead of living it. Before he and Mick had to split up to head home the previous afternoon, Devin had said to Mick, "In it together." Mick had repeated the words flatly, like a robot running low on power. That had worried Devin before he went to bed that night. This morning he wasn't concerned. Mick would be quiet. And Mick was, in fact, quiet. Too quiet. One of the things that Devin had always been able to count on for the previous 10 years was that his school days would be full with Mick chattering. Today, though, Mick wasn't chattering. The boys were now settling in against the stone wall where they liked to eat lunch outside, and Mick hadn't said more than "Hey, Dev," since Devin had met up with him and to walk to school. Devin was still in a twilight-like state of denial, but the twilight was wearing off. When Mrs. Patterson had noted Kelsey's absence from class, the flimsy barrier between Devin and what he'd done tore a little bit. The details were coming back. Mick opened his lunch sack with none of his usual enthusiasm. Devin tried to animate his friend. "What did you get today?" Mick's mom always put in at least one treat in Mick's lunch. "Huh?" Mick sniffed. "Oh, I don't know." Devin sighed. Mick set down his sack and leaned towards Devin. He whispered, "I can't stop thinking about him." "Shh," Devin hissed. "Not here." Mick's eyes moistened, and his face turned red. Devin glanced around, then patted Mick's hand. "It's okay. We'll talk about it this afternoon, okay? We'll go to our camp." He hoped the words "our camp" would soothe Mick. Mick liked it when Devin called their makeshift, tarp-covered temporary meeting place our camp. Mick wiped his eyes. "Okay." But he said it so quietly Devin could barely hear him. Settled cross-legged on the cool but dry forest floor, Mick played with a pile of tiny fir cones. Devin watched him, waiting for his friend to speak. He waited for several minutes. Finally Mick said, "What if he's still alive?" He glanced up from his fir cone art, then looked back down. "That's what I can't stop thinking about. What if he's still alive?" Devin didn't respond. He'd thought about that too, but he was trying not to. "I almost puked when they called his name in class," Mick said. Devin could relate, but he didn't say so. Instead he said, "I don't think he's still alive." Mick raised his head and blinked at Devin. "But you're not sure?" Devin shook his head. He could almost hear the ripping sound as the flimsy barrier protecting him from the previous day tore open a little more. He screwed his eyes shut, as if that would help. "No, I'm not sure." Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. By Wednesday, panicked fear and mystery rippled through the school like concussive waves radiating outward from a ground zero event. It was all anyone was talking about. Where was Kelsey? The police had been called in. Mick stayed home from school sick for all 3 days. When Devin went to see him, Mick swore he wouldn't say anything to anyone. But Mick couldn't keep any food down. His mother thought he had a stomach flu. Devin handled the whole thing better than Mick. His years living outside the social groups of the school had given him the ability to keep his face neutral, no matter how he felt on the inside. He was able to go about his business nearly invisibly. He was sure he looked normal, even though he was anything but. Every muscle in his body felt rigid. It hurt to move. But he couldn't be still either. By the end of the week, Devin had nearly chewed his nails off. On Friday afternoon, Mr. Wright announced to the school that the police concluded Kelsey had run away. Apparently no one had seen Kelsey leave the school with Devin and Mick, and apparently Kelsey hadn't told anyone where he was going. Neither one of these things surprised Devin. As far as he knew, only he and Mick left the school the way they did. They were the only ones who ever cut through the railway yard. And of course Kelsey wouldn't tell anyone he was going someplace with Mick and Devin. You only had to be in the school a couple days to know that it was social suicide to hang out with Mick and Devin. Kelsey was smart enough to have figured that out. Devin was still surprised Kelsey had even apologized to them on Monday. He thought it would be much harder to lure Kelsey to... Accidents happen. Devin visited Mick on Friday afternoon. Mick was eating a bowl of soup when Devin arrived. "He's keeping his food down," Mick's mom said, giving Devin a hug in the doorway of Mick's room. "I doubt he's contagious or anything. Go on in." "Thanks, Mrs. Callahan," Devin smiled at the round, red-headed, freckled woman. He felt he had bugs crawling up his arms. It was her hug. He'd felt the same every time his mom had hugged him during the week. He didn't deserve hugs. "Do you want any soup, dear?" Mrs. Callahan asked. "There's plenty." Devin shook his head. No thank you." Mrs. Callahan chucked him under the chin. "You boys are growing up so fast." She bustled away. Devin plopped down in the red beanbag chair just inside the door of Mick and Debbie's room. "Hey," he said to Mick. He glanced at the bright blue and yellow polka dot divider curtain. Mick, tucked under a red superhero blanket in its bed, propped up with pillows in matching cases, wiped his mouth. "Hey." He looked like he was going to say something else, but then he went back to eating his soup from a huge orange bowl. Devin looked around the tiny half-room. Unlike Devin's room, which was pretty bare except for a few nature posters and a couple rock collections, Mick's room was packed with toys. It didn't look like a 15-year-old's room, it looked like a kid's room. Mick's part of the room didn't have much furniture, just a bed, a nightstand, and some shelves with a drop-down desk built in. The shelves held books, but they were also crowded with superhero and sci-fi action figures and stacks of board games. Devin looked at the curtain again. Mick must have noticed. "Debbie's staying over at a friend's house." Devin nodded. Mick dropped his spoon. It hit the bowl with a clatter. He wiped his mouth and then said through the napkin as he held it through his face, "What if he's still alive?" Devin whipped around to be sure the door was still closed. "She's in the kitchen," Mick said. "Dad's not home." He shoved his tray away. "I haven't told anyone, and I'm not going to, but I can't stop thinking about him. What if he's alive? It's been 6 days." "Yeah, but he's not alive." "But he could be." "How? He can't move, and he doesn't have water." "How long can people go without water?" Mick asked. Before Devin could try to answer that question, Mick said, "Wait, there was water in the kitchen." Devin tensed. Mick was right. "What if Kelsey managed to get that?" Mick asked. "How? The suit was really heavy, and he lost a lot of blood." Understatement of the year. Mick twisted his mouth and thought about that. True, but what if the suit worked with him? Like, he said some suits like that can. What if it helped him get to the kitchen? Devin thought that sounded pretty out there, but what part of what happened wasn't out there? If that happened, he could still be alive, and we can't leave him there like that. Mick leaned forward. "I'll be quiet, I swear, but first we have to go back and make sure he's, well, or not. If he's alive, we have to help him. We just do, that's all." Mick wasn't going to let this go. "Okay," Devin said, "but we're not going. I'll go." "But no way is your mom going to let you go into the woods. She thinks you've had the flu. And if you're right, we can't wait any longer. I'll go." "What if he's alive? How will you get him to a hospital?" "I'll call someone after I check on him." Remembering the building's cell phone dead zone, he said, I'll take bandages and stuff with me so I can... what do they call it? Stabilize. So I can stabilize him. What I can do is stay there with him and take care of him until he's better. I can take food and stuff. Then when he's better, I'll leave and go to cell phone range to call for help. That will give me more time, too, to convince him not to tell anyone anything. Mick rubbed his nose and thought this over. Finally, he said, "That's a good idea." Devin looked at his innocent friend. Mick had no clue. Devin struggled out of the beanbag chair and went to Mick's bed. He put a hand on Mick's shoulder. "You have to make me a promise." "What?" "I don't know how long it's going to take me to get Kelsey out of the suit and help him get well. You have to cover for me." Mick nodded. "How?" "I'm going to tell my mom I'm spending a few days here because you need the company since Debbie is gone. She'll go for that." "Okay." "And if I'm not back by Monday, you have to tell the teachers I'm homesick. Got it?" "Sure, I can do that." "And for as long as it takes, keep telling them I'm sick. Are you sure you can do that?" Mick nodded. "No matter what, you can't tell anyone where I am." "Okay. I'll in it together swear if you want." Devin shrugged. "Sure." He held out his index finger and listened to Mick's in it together swear that he'd cover Devin's tracks for as long as he needed. "You're a good friend," Devin said. Mick grinned. When he got home from visiting Mick, Devin told his mom he was going back. "Oh, that's nice of you, kiddo," she said. She looked relieved. Devin figured she was thinking about going to bed early. Devin went into his sparse room. He looked around. He still wasn't sure what he was going to do when he got back to the pizzeria, but if he was going back, he'd need tools. He sat down on the edge of his twin bed. It sagged under his weight, and he heard one of the box springs groan. What if he didn't go back at all, and just told Mick he'd gone back and found Kelsey dead? No, he couldn't do it. Even though he'd slept well Monday night, every night since then he'd had nightmares. In every nightmare, Kelsey was a zombie, stalking Devin no matter where he went. No, he had to go back and be sure. He picked up his backpack. He pulled his books and phone out of it. He glanced at the phone inside. Great, it was dead. Oh well, he put it on the charger. He wouldn't be able to use it near the building anyway. He looked around again. His gaze landed on the hammer lying on the floor of his open closet. He'd taken it from his mom's meager supplies of tools to fix a shelf a couple weeks before, and he'd never put it away. That would do to open the suit, if it came to that. The sun was starting to sink into the horizon by the time Devin reached the blackberry-choked building. Before he ducked under the collapsed animal head opening, he got out his flashlight and his hammer. As he had since he'd entered the forest, he did his best to ignore the rustling, churring, and crackling he heard in the woods. Just little forest animals, he kept telling himself, as he nervously ate the chocolate candy bar that would serve as his dinner. And what would be waiting inside the building? Taking a deep breath, Devin crawled into the building's outer entrance, and then hesitated only a few seconds before slipping it through the sidelight. Once there, though, he froze, shining his flashlight around in jerky spasms. He half expected Kelsey in the bloody bear suit to loom up in front of him and attack. He was poised to escape back through the sidelight. But nothing came at him. He was alone. Well, alone except for Kelsey's body in the bear suit and the animatronic characters on the stage. Devin took a tentative step and paused. He listened. The building was totally silent. It felt sinister. Devin had the urge to run, even though nothing was moving. Nothing was chasing him. He quelled his fears and moved forward. Bypassing the blood-soaked bear suit in the middle of the room, Devin did a tour of the entire building. He went into every room and shined his light into every nook and cranny. He'd watched enough TV to know that you cleared the building before you let down your guard. Everything was exactly as they'd left it when they were here on Monday, except for the smell. The earthly, metallic odor of blood had hit Devin as soon as he'd stepped into the building. Another smell warred with the smell of blood. It was a sickly, sweet, a nauseating smell. Devin was pretty sure it was the smell of decay, but he wasn't sure. Okay, he'd put it off as long as he could. With slow, shuffling steps, Devin approached the bear suit. He stopped when he reached the outer edge of the blood pool. It was easy to spot. The blood had blackened as it dried. It was now darker than the floor, and its outline stood out starkly in the glow of Devin's flashlight. Gritting his teeth, Devin bent over and touched the edge of the blood. He yanked his hand back. It was still a little sticky. Okay, that was okay. He was prepared for this. He didn't know how long it took blood to completely dry, but he figured the damp atmosphere of the building would slow down the process. Devin took off his backpack and pulled out the plastic tarp he'd folded and stuffed into it. Instead of bringing the food and bandages he'd promised Mick he'd bring, he'd brought the tarp. He knew Kelsey couldn't be alive, and he didn't want to have to sit in blood to check Kelsey's... Devin made himself stop thinking. He set his backpack against the wall, and he spread the tarp over the blood near the head of the suit. He had to breathe through his nose, because here the blood and decay smells were stronger. Kelsey had to be dead. Devin wouldn't be able to sleep, though, unless he knew for sure. He trained his light on the bear's head. His muscles stiffened because he expected to see Kelsey's eyes staring back at him through the eye holes of the bear's head. But nothing. The eye holes were empty. Dark. Devin leaned closer, aiming the light down into the holes. Why couldn't he see Kelsey's face? He checked over his shoulder to be sure he was still alone. Had the characters on the stage moved? He sucked in his breath and ran his flashlight's beam over them. He frowned. He couldn't remember how they'd been positioned before. He watched for several more seconds before turning his flashlight back to his task. He put his face closer to the bear's face. He still couldn't see anything. He'd have to take off the head. That meant touching the bloody fur. Good thing he'd prepared for that, too. Devin dug into his pants pocket and pulled out a pair of his mother's rubber cleaning gloves. He put them on. propping the flashlight on the bear's chest to aim it at the neck and hesitating for a second to be sure the chest wasn't moving. Devin felt for the lock mechanism that held his head in place. It took him only seconds to find it, but it wouldn't release. He pushed, he pulled, he pinched. He finally pounded on it with his hammer, but the head wouldn't let go of the torso. Fine. Devin inserted the claw part of the hammer into the bear's mouth. Using his other hand for leverage, he pried the mouth open. He sucked in his breath at the ratcheting sound the mouth made when it yawned open. It sounded like teeth gnashing together, which made no sense. It was opening, not closing. Letting out his breath, Devin lit up the mouth opening with his flashlight. He tilted his head and looked as far into the head as he could. Nothing was inside of it. Really? Devin shined the flashlight into the head some more. For sure empty. Had the bear suit cut off Kelsey's head? Yeah, and done what with it? Ate it? Goosebumps sprang up on Devin's arms, because he was reminded of the bounce house story. If a bounce house could eat a toddler, a bear costume could eat a teenager. Right? Get a grip, he muttered. Somewhere in the building, something sputtered faintly. Devin whipped his head around and aimed his flashlight all around the room. It had sounded sort of like a fizzle, like a hoarse exhale. Had it come from behind him? In front of him? He rotated back quickly so he could inspect the bear suit again. Its bloody fur gleamed in the light, but it wasn't moving. Get on with it, Devin commanded himself. He bent over and directed his light into the bear's mouth again. This time, he concentrated on trying to see down into the torso. At first he didn't see anything, but then he thought he saw something further down. Had Kelsey somehow slid down into the suit? Was that his hair that Devin could see? He turned his light this way and that, but he couldn't see any better. He'd have to feel. Happy for the gloves he wore, Devin squared his shoulders and took a deep breath. Then he slid his arm through the bear's mouth down inside the bear suit until all but the uppermost part of his arm was inside. He felt around his hand, but he still didn't feel anything. But he heard something. Someone or something called his name. Devin! Devin jerked and started to yank his arm from the suit, but the mouth clamped down on his arm and locked shut with a simultaneous clank and crack. The crack was the bone in Devin's arm. Devin screamed at the searing pain that shot through his bicep all the way down to the tips of his fingers. Tears sprang into his eyes. He wailed in agony and fear. He also tried to pull his arm out of the bear suit. Bad idea. He howled and held very still. Sweat joined the tears running down his face. Moving his arm was pure torture. It felt like the bear was trying to rip the arm off his body. Nausea crawled up from his stomach and choked him. He gagged and turned his head to vomit all over his lap. The acidic smell and putrid brown chunky spew made him gag again, and he let loose with another torrent of puke. Bawling now, Devin yelled for help, even though he knew help wasn't going to come. Help! The sound he made was even worse than the sound Kelsey had made when the suit had impaled him. It was definitely worse than the dying cat. It was the sound of anguish and despair. It was the sound of hopelessness. Spittle dripped from his mouth as his cry dissolved into a sob. Ignoring the torment of lava-hot pain in his right arm, Devin used his left hand to pound ineffectually at the bear's mouth. He kept hitting his arm with a hammerhead, and he shrieked every time he did. Still, he kept trying to pound the mouth open. When he finally lost the strength to hold the hammer and it bounced off the bear's torso and hit the bloody floor with a thunk, he started trying to drag the bear suit across the floor. He was out of his head, not thinking logically. He knew he couldn't move the suit. Collapsing in his own disgusting stink, Devin curled onto his side, whimpering at every fresh wave of pain that tore through his arm. He tried to ignore the faint sensation of wet warmth trickling down his bicep. Calm down, he told himself. Mick knew where he was. Mick would come for him. Devin moaned. No, he wouldn't. Mick would do what Devin told him to do. How long did it take to bleed to death? Not long if he was bleeding a lot, but he didn't think so. It didn't feel like he was bleeding much. The trickle of warmth stopped at his elbow joint, and it wasn't moving any more. No, he wasn't going to bleed to death. So how long before he died for lack of water? That was what was going to happen. He hadn't brought water because he hadn't planned on helping Kelsey, so now he couldn't help himself. Inside the suit, he flexed his fingers. He moaned when the movement sent another volley of pain up his arm. Then he froze, sucked in his breath, and clenched his fingers into a fist. Had he just felt something move inside the suit? No, not... Another slight brush of something moving grazed his knuckles. Bugs, Devin whispered. He watched enough TV to know that the bugs liked the dead bodies. It was bugs, right? Not... No, it couldn't be. Kelsey? Devin thrashed his entire body, writhing violently in crazed panic. He threw his whole body into it, screaming through the pain the flailing caused in his arm. Vomit sprayed, and the plastic tarp crackled around him. He didn't stop. He fought to free himself with every bit of strength he had left. But it wasn't enough. In fact, it was making things worse. After one of his bucking movements, Devin felt his arm loosen for just an instant, but the second it didn't start to come out, it went further in. With dread, Devin looked at the suit and realized the mouth had opened farther. The suit was clamped around his shoulder instead of his bicep. Now he knew. He was going to die here. He couldn't get his arm free, and he couldn't move the suit, and Mick was going to be sure no one came for him. Mick had disagreed with Devin plenty of times over the years, but he never went against Devin. Not one single time. Devin thought about the movie he saw where the man sawed his arm off to free himself when he got his arm caught under a boulder. He gagged and retched. Not a good thought. And not helpful either. Even if he had a knife or a saw, he didn't think he could do that. Devin wiggled in one more attempt to free himself. The mouth opened even more, and Devin got a sudden glimpse inside the suit. He gasped, and for a moment, shock blocked his pain. Down low, past his arm, Devin could see a body. A dead body. Just like he thought he'd find when he came back here to check. But it wasn't exactly like he thought he'd find. The body he thought he'd find didn't have blonde hair. This one had curly black hair. The body in the suit wasn't Kelsey. Devin only had a second to try to make sense of this before his shoulder was sucked into the suit. Devin screamed, but no one heard him. On Monday morning, Mick was disappointed when Devin didn't meet Mick on his walk to school. Mick hoped he'd find Devin waiting for him at the lockers, waiting to tell Kelsey he was going to be okay. Or even waiting to tell him Kelsey was dead. That wasn't as good, but it would be better than the way they'd left things last week. Not knowing whether Kelsey was dead or alive was like being eaten alive, like getting digested by that creep-style bounce house in the story Devin read in English class a couple weeks ago. Was that just a couple weeks ago? Speaking of English class, Mick was supposed to read a poem out loud today. Remembering that made his stomach churn. It twisted up his insides so much he didn't worry too much about Devin not being in school. Devin had told him it might take a while to get Kelsey well enough to move him. Something about that seemed... Someone bumped into Mick, and he dropped his backpack. He bent over, picked it up, and went to class. In English class, Mick was reading his poem over and over while Mrs. Patterson did roll call. He was so into it, he jumped when Mrs. Patterson called out, "Mick!" "Here." "Yes, I know you're here. I asked if you knew where our budding horror writer is." "Huh?" "Devin. Where's Devin?" "Oh, sorry, he's homesick." "Okay." Mick smiled. He'd done his part. In it together, for as long as it takes. Kelsey leaned against a column in the rotunda of his new school. He watched the other kids, and he smiled or nodded at everyone who passed him, saying hey when someone said hello. His gaze kept returning to a couple of boys who lingered outside the front doors of the school. One of the boys wore all black. The other wore ragged jeans and a faded t-shirt. Other kids coming into the school ignored the boys or gave them scathing looks. Both boys occasionally snickered at the passing kids. Kelsey pushed off from the columns and strolled toward the boys as they finally sauntered into the school. He stopped in front of them and said, "Hey, I'm Kelsey. I'm new here." Both boys eyed him, brows raised. He gave them each a big friendly grin. "So," Kelsey said, "any cool places to hang out around here?" Larson sat at the elegant oak roll-top desk that dominated one end of his otherwise anything but elegant living room. If he sat at the desk, the top of which held an antique green banker's lamp, and above which hung a print of an eagle flying over a meadow, his back was to the rest of the room. From here, he could pretend the other part of his living room didn't exist. Everything else in the room, the stained card table, 2 folding chairs, a ratty easy chair, and a blue vinyl beanbag chair, only made the place seem more empty and sad. Taking a sip from the glass he held balanced against his chest, he looked at the framed picture of Ryan that the banker's lamp illuminated. Ryan had been 6 when the picture was taken. He'd just lost his front 2 baby teeth. The resulting gap gave him his freckled, blue-eyed face and an impish look Larson loved. People said Ryan was the spitting image of his dad. Larson guessed he saw it. For sure he and his son shared dirty blonde hair, freckles, blue eyes, and a wide mouth. Ryan had gotten his mom's nose, which was good for Ryan, but sometimes all Larson saw when he looked at his son were the differences between them. To Larson, his own face looked hard and closed, while Ryan's was still eager and open. How long did it stay that way? A few days before, Larson had gotten a glimpse of what Ryan would look like when the possibilities of childhood collapsed into the obligations of adulthood. Larson had promised, swearing on a stack of comic books no less, that he'd take Ryan to see a movie premiere. Work had gotten in the way, and Larson had cancelled. Ryan hadn't taken it too well. "You don't do anything you'll say you do," Ryan had screamed. His face was red and contorted with crushing disappointment. "I'm sorry, Ryan." Ryan had sniffled. "Teacher says dads are like superheroes, but you're not. Superheroes don't break promises." Larson's phone rang, and he snatched it up. Anything that could save him from the memory of his many regrets would be welcome. "The Stitch Wraith was spotted again," Chief Monahan rasped. "I want you to get over there." "Where?" "The old fire site. Remember that bizarre fire?" "Sure." Larson set down his drink, glad he'd only had a couple of sips. "I'll be there in 10. He stood. "Wait, isn't that the second time it's been spotted there?" Don pulled open the heavy metal door of the old X factory, and he and Frank headed to the food truck parked in the middle of what used to be one of the defunct factory's assembly rooms. The truck, no longer mobile, was permanently placed in the room, and it was surrounded by wood picnic tables. It was a weird setup. But then again, Dr. Phineas Taggart, the man who owned it all, was weird too. Don spotted Phineas sitting on top of the picnic table benches, and he nudged Frank. They watched Phineas carefully pull the tail of his pristine white lab coat out from under him and smooth it. Then, just as carefully, spread a white linen napkin on the rough table in front of him. He flicked a speck of dirt from the napkin's corner, then opened his sandwich wrapper in the precise center of the napkin. "Thank you," Phineas said to the sandwich. "Cells, please process this food with love." "Still talking to your food, Phineas?" Don called. He rolled his eyes and winked at Frank. Frank just shook his head. They watched Phineas close his eyes. It looked like he was praying, but he once told him he was creating a mental shield out of light when he did that. Whatever that meant. "Hello, Don," Phineas said. "As I have previously explained, I am not talking to my food per se. I am talking to cells, both the cells in the food and those in my body." Right. Don nudged Frank again. "Can you say one sandwich short of a picnic?" he muttered to Frank. Frank, who had the same darkly tanned face and forearms and broad, thick shoulders that Don had, set his hard hat on the picnic table next to the one Phineas sat at, and he stepped over to the food truck to order his food. "How's that, shield coming?" Don asked, dumping his hard hat next to Frank's. Phineas watched Reuben scribble down Frank's order. Then he looked at Don. "I'm developing a modicum of expertise with shield creation," Phineas said. Frank returned from ordering and plopped on the picnic table's bench. Dust billowed up from his thighs when he sat. Don noticed Phineas's nose twitch. He probably wasn't thrilled with how sweaty he and Frank smelled. Phineas was a little prissy. "You gotta hear this, Frank," Don said. He nodded at Phineas. "Tell him." Phineas looked at his sandwich, but then he straightened his narrow red tie and adjusted his stiff collar of his gray dress shirt. He cleared his throat. "The creation of a personal field has its origin in the work of a psychologist who did a series of experiments on the effect of being stared at." "Why would anyone study that?" Frank asked. Don, who stood at Reuben's counter ordering his food, said, "I hate being stared at. Makes my skin crawl." He loved winding Phineas up and listening to him spout off about all the weird stuff he was into. "Precisely," Phineas said. "That's why the psychologist was studying the phenomenon. Why does it bother us when people stare at us?" To measure the test results, the psychologist used EDA, electrodermal activity readings. The readings show responses of the sympathetic nervous system. "That makes sense," Don lied. He winked at Frank, who grinned. Phineas was oblivious to their amusement. He continued his informational download. The results of his experiment were that those being stared at showed significantly higher electrodermal activity when they were being stared at than would have been expected by chance. Frank shrugged. "So what?" He rolled his eyes at Don, who chuckled. "So," Phineas went on, "this man did other experiments as well. He wanted to know if it was possible for people to influence others with negative intentions. If it was, could one protect oneself from these negative intentions? He conducted more experiments, in which one group of subjects was given no instructions, and another group was instructed to visualize a protective shield on barrier that would protect against interference of another person's mind. The experimenters then attempted to raise all of the subjects' EDA levels by staring at them and willing the levels to rise. The result was that the group that had shielded themselves showed far fewer physical effects than the other unshielded subjects. "So will your shield stop speeding bullets?" Don laughed as he took his grilled ham and cheese sandwich from Reuben. Phineas smiled. "Speeding bullets aren't nearly as dangerous as human emotion." He picked up his sandwich and took a bite. Frank snorted. With his mouth full, he said, "That's just stupid. My neighbor's anger can't leave me gut shot, but the old lady's shotgun can." "You're looking only at the short-term timeline," Phineas said. "You see the result of the shotgun's energy, so it seems greater to you. Human emotion is slower to impact, more insidious. It emanates from us, or is excreted from us, if you will, like sweat or tears, and it wafts outward like a noxious cloud, soaking into the surroundings. For some time I've been studying the effect of these emotions. I'm getting close to a breakthrough." Phineas left his ersatz friends by the food truck and returned to the main part of the X factory, his private area. He wished the food truck was his private area too, but alas, Reuben wouldn't agree to that. When Phineas used to work at Evergreen Laboratories, Reuben's food truck used to be parked outside the ugly concrete building that housed the labs. When Phineas retired, he asked Reuben to set up shop in Phineas's factory converted to laboratory, because he loved Reuben's food. Reuben agreed, only if he could remain open to the public in general. Hence the presence of men like Don and Frank. Phineas knew that they and others thought he was nutty, but he still occasionally enjoyed their company. Phineas brushed his teeth after lunch and made sure he still looked spiffy. Being retired was no excuse to get sloppy. So Phineas still dressed as he had for work, and he still kept his graying hair trimmed short and his round, homely face clean-shaven. When he was growing up, his mother had told him, "Being ugly is no excuse to be a slob." She also frequently asked him, "What do you need looks for when you have such a brain?" Phineas agreed with his mom, which was why his life's work, not the pointless pharmaceutical work he did as his job, but his true calling, was the study of the paranormal, the study of energy and its effects on all matter, animate and supposedly inanimate. Satisfied that he was presentable, Phineas left the bathroom and walked down the narrow hall to his protected room. Punching in his security code and deactivating the pneumatic seal that guarded his treasures from errant energies such as those of mold spores and the like, Phineas entered the all-white room of shelving and glass cabinets. Indulging himself, as he did daily, he strolled up and down the rows looking at his accumulated bounty. Phineas knew that to the untrained eye, the items in this room would look like either entire rubbish or the collection of a horror movie aficionado. It all depended on the perspective. Only Phineas knew that every item in this room was said to be haunted. Haunted was not a term he himself used. Usually used as a word to refer to something embodied by a ghost, the word could also mean part of what Phineas knew to be true of all things. Haunted could mean showing signs of torment, or some kind of mental anguish, and this was the more important definition of the word. These items on Phineas's shelves weren't possessed by ghosts. The ones that were truly haunted were energized by agony. The rack, the head crusher, the wheel, the Judas cradle. These torture devices were some of the purest examples Phineas had collected, but he also had everything from Madonna's image on toast, to non-mechanical dolls that opened their eyes by themselves, to a rocking chair that rocked on its own. He'd acquired all of these special objects from online auctions. He loved each and every one of them. But he couldn't linger here all day. He had work to do. Exiting the protected room, Phineas returned to his small office, where a laptop computer sat in the middle of a simple oak desk. There, he began to type up his latest findings. "As I expected," he typed. "Extreme human emotion appears to impact its surroundings far more powerfully than the more negative it is. Agony, I'm convinced, radiates farther from people than any other emotion. Love has its influence, but the experiments being done with water crystals have been misinterpreted. Just because love forms beautiful ice crystals doesn't mean it's the most powerful emotion. Yesterday I mimicked the ice crystal methodology, and by allowing all the hurt and anger I usually keep well in check to burst forth, I watched water manifest a hideous crystal in a matter of seconds." Phineas stood and crossed the grow light over his collection of exotic flowers. He ran his fingertips over the lobster claw-shaped yellow and orange heliconia, the satisfyingly symmetrical lavender lotus flower, the red clusters of a flowering ginger, and the brighter red perfumed passion flowers that reminded him of blood-soaked starfish. Other researchers had their water. Phineas had his flowers. He believed flowers, not water, were nature's purest vessels for emotion. He was drawn particularly to the passion flower, because the passion flower was known to hold a vibration so pure and innocent that its energy could repattern consciousness. Phineas leaned over and inhaled the flower's pungently sweet scent. This flower, he learned from an expert in flower energy essences, was known to repair the ego. It could literally mend the superego and facilitate enlightenment. He believed that he was approaching the day when he was so attuned to the flow of his own energy that he could get in resonance with this extraordinary blossom. But for now, Phineas checked his watch. It was time. Every week, Phineas received a new shipment of emotionally charged items. This week, he had some very special objects coming. Hurrying down the hall to the loading dock at the back of his old brick factory, Phineas practically skipped over the stone floor. He couldn't wait to see his new purchases. "Yo, Finn," a burly bald man called when Phineas stepped onto the concrete platform. "Hello, Flynn." Phineas bounced on the balls of his feet and rubbed his hands together. He leaned forward to peer into Flynn's truck. "What have you?" Flynn leaned over and picked up a box. He grinned. "You're putting me on. You know what you've ordered. Today's the special day, right?" Phineas laughed. Flynn leaned back and widened his warm brown eyes. "Whoa, Doc, that's some mad scientist evil laugh you got there. Do you like it? I've been practicing." "Nailed it." Flynn, his pink head glistening in the sun and his back muscles rippling under his black t-shirt, began unloading boxes onto the dock. Phineas didn't bother explaining to Flynn that Phineas didn't even have a natural laugh. One of the reasons he was so fascinated by the bandwidth of human emotion was because he could never seem to access the whole range of emotions himself. He didn't have a natural laugh because he'd never felt real joy. What he felt now, though, had to be close. Flynn unloaded the fourth box from Phineas's shipment, checked his manifest, and said, "That's it, Doc. Let me just get the handcart and I'll take this stuff back to your lab." "Thank you, Flynn." Phineas was careful not to add a "hurry up," even though he wanted to. Flynn wasn't dawdling. Phineas was just impatient. Flynn tossed the handcart onto the dock, then jumped up and stacked the boxes. The tower was over his head, but he said, "Got it," and went down the hall, holding the top two boxes on the cart with his left hand as he pushed the cart with his right. Phineas scurried after him. It only took a few seconds to reach the main lab, which was the vaulted core of the factory, what had once been the factory floor. Previously full of automated assembly equipment, this space was now home to Phineas's various methods of measuring energy. Like Broad, he had his EDA. He also had his EEG, his REG, his MRI, and his X-ray machines. He used all of them at one time or another in his experiments designed to measure the emotional energy left behind in objects that had been near the site of a tragedy. "Right here, Flynn." Phineas pointed at two large bare tables, and Flynn shifted the stack of boxes to the floor between them. He gave Phineas a salute. "Have a good one." "I will." Before Flynn had taken a step, Phineas was tearing into the first box. Peering into it, he saw a stack of party plates. "Wonderful," he said. He opened the second box, which was flat and oblong. When the box was open, Phineas found himself staring at his own reflection. This was the decorative wall mirror that had watched a man murder his entire family. Oh, what agony might this contain? Phineas ran his hands over the shiny surface. Then he took a deep breath and opened the large square box. As he suspected, this box contained yet another box, an empty jack-in-the-box. Wonderful. This was going to have a lot of juicy agony in it. And last but not least, yes, there it was. Lying in a puffery of styrofoam peanuts, a man-sized endoskeleton lay, just waiting to be activated and given a purpose. Phineas lifted the endoskeleton from the box, and he frowned when it hung limply in his arms. He hadn't expected it to be this broken. Well, no matter. At the moment, it looked like nothing. Just a ruptured metal network made to stand in for human bones. But it wouldn't be nothing for much longer. "Don't worry," Phineas said. "I'll provide." Phineas got right to work. Hooking together the lines and electrodes of his various energy-measuring devices, he set up what he thought of as an energy cascade. The machine would pour energy already captured from previous items into the first new item, in this case the plates, and then usher the energy through all the additional new items until they culminated in the endoskeleton. Phineas stepped back to watch the process. Not that there was anything to see. Unfortunately, the transfer of emotional energy occurred at a frequency the human eye couldn't discern. If Phineas turned out all the lights and used a blue light, he could detect just a bit of the energy flow. He discovered, however, that blue light tended to distort the field. He couldn't risk turning it on now. Instead, heating his growling stomach, Phineas decided to return to the food truck for an early dinner. "How's your daughter doing?" Phineas asked Reuben, while Reuben fried the portobello mushroom from Phineas's veggie burger. Reuben shrugged, his black ponytail swaying. "Still painfully shy." "I could give you a remedy for that. A flower essence called mimulus." Reuben leaned on the counter and cocked his head with a smirk. "What's a flower essence?" He made it clear that he was poking fun at the idea. Phineas disregarded Reuben's tone. In the early part of the last century, a homeopath discovered that diluted energies of various plants and flowers had an impact on emotion and the physical body. A flower essence called mimulus transforms fear into strength. So a flower would make her less shy. Reuben shook his head and looked up at the ceiling in what even Phineas could tell was a "now I've heard everything" expression. Phineas ignored the dismissal. Not exactly. The energy of a flower would make her more confident. Only a molecule or two of any given flower is suspended in a solution of water and alcohol for each flower remedy. Oh crap. Reuben realized he'd burned the mushroom. Sorry. He started over. "So, is that what you're working on? Flower energies?" "Not quite." Phineas straightened and clasped his hands. "You see, I'm convinced that agony has a greater energetic radius and power than any other emotion. I've done numerous experiments to measure, capture, contain, and study the leftover emotion embedded in objects that were near a tragedy. My work is focused on my hypothesis that you can take a saturation of agony, add any kind of intelligence, even an artificial one, and they will combine together to transmute the energy of emotion into the energy of physical action. This, I believe, is what explains what people call haunted objects." Reuben laughed, shook his head, and managed to properly cook Phineas's portobello. "No disrespect, Doc, but I'm glad I don't believe in magic. Your flower essences sound like hocus pocus. But the rest of that stuff you just said, that's even worse. It's bad mojo." "Maybe," Phineas admitted, "but maybe it's the key to understanding the energy of all things." By the time Phineas returned to his lab, the endoskeleton lit up like a Christmas tree when Phineas tested his energy levels. It was ready. Now he just needed to give it a bit more presence so it could properly express the agony it had soaked in from other items. Phineas hurried to his protected room. He knew exactly what he needed, so it only took a few minutes to place the items in separate boxes and return to the lab. There, he put the boxes on the table next to the bare endoskeleton. Running his hands over the metal skeleton, he reveled at the electric energy dancing at his fingertips. "First, a head," he whispered. Reaching into the first box he'd set on the table, Phineas pulled out a 3-foot-tall white doll, covered in drawings done in colored markers. The doll was truly an abomination of decorative overkill. It had rainbow fingertips, green knees, brown smudges on its body and legs, and various bibs and bobs glued to it, one of which appeared to be a smiley face eraser. Uninterested in the doll's body, Phineas grabbed the doll's flat black marker-drawn face and pulled it from the doll's neck. He then affixed the head to the top of the endoskeleton. "That's better," he said. "Gives you some personality." He reached into the second box. And now for some heart. The item in the second box was an animatronic dog that clearly no longer functioned. Phineas set his shoulders and prepared himself to touch it. The dog was an ugly dog, as ugly as Phineas himself, what with its matted grayish-brown fur, triangle-shaped head, and wide mouth full of sharp teeth. But it wasn't just ugly. It was wrong somehow. Of all the items in Phineas's collection, he found this dog to be the most menacing. He sensed the dog had been responsible for some powerful agony. He'd never been entirely comfortable having it around. But now, he was going to take it apart, so it wouldn't be a threat. Using sharp shears, Phineas tore into the dog's fur. Then he used pliers to pull out wires and circuitry. In minutes, he'd revealed the dog's battery pack, located in the dog's chest where its heart would have been if it had been a living dog. Lifting the large plastic-encased unit trailing a tangle of entwined wires, Phineas studied the endoskeleton. Where to install it? Phineas dismissed plug-ins in the endoskeleton's head and neck, and instead found a suitable port in the endoskeleton's chest. He grinned when he looked at it. "Huh, there. Now my Tin Man has a heart." He chuckled. The moment the endoskeleton got its heart, it became more than an endoskeleton. It became an animatronic being of great energy. And it moved. Phineas laughed, genuinely laughed, in pure glee. The being of great energy reacted to Phineas's laugh by turning to look at Phineas with its black marker eyes. Phineas kept laughing, and the being reached out to touch its creator. Phineas held his breath as the metal fingers met his skin. Then, in one crowded instant, 3 things happened. Phineas saw the being's battery pack pulse bright red.